All right, I'm joined on the Presilience podcast once again by my esteemed colleagues Leanne Close and Jason Alcorn. Thanks for joining us, folks.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
So for those of you that haven't listened in the past two episodes with Leanne and Jason, Leanne, can I get you just to give the 30-second snapshot of your background relevant to the topic at hand?
Sure. So prior to joining Risk Dissolution Group, I was a Deputy Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police and police officer in the AFP for over 33 years.
Yeah, that will be certainly relevant as we're talking about an incident at Canberra Airport. So thank you for that. Jason, if you could do the same, 30-second snapshot of who you are.
Yeah, originally background in policing up in the Northern Territory and then federally, mostly drug enforcement, investigations, counter-terrorism. And since then, working corporates, financial services sector and media in a safety, security, risk management roles.
Excellent. And my name is Joe Saunders, and I'll be moderating as well as contributing to this particular discussion mostly through the lens of my expertise in workplace violence prevention and some of the lessons perhaps in violence prevention generally that we can take from the incident that happened on the weekend. So for those of you that maybe are not in the loop of what we're talking about, so yesterday, as of time of recording, which was 14th of August 2022, there was an incident at Canberra Airport at about 1:20 in the afternoon where a 63-year-old man produced a handgun of some variety and has discharged at least 5 shots into glass panels, we understand. Thankfully, no one was injured, but it was certainly a bit of a wake-up call and a bit of a shake-up for airport security. And the AFP police or the protective service response was, from all accounts, quite good. But certainly, we're very lucky to have escaped an incident like that without a much bigger, more tragic ending. So, Leanne, I might just throw to you first as we unpack this. Firstly, about the police response, how fortunate we are that it happened in an airport where there is a significant police presence and security presence and so on, and maybe just talk to some of that.
Sure, Joe. So since about even before 2014, but certainly in 2014 when the alert security level in Australia went up to probable. It's a security assessment that ASIO do every year. The Director General pops that out. And we've had a really strong response of aviation policing across most of our major airports in Australia. And Canberra Airport is certainly one of those where police are stationed and patrolling on the ground. So when the incident allegedly occurred there yesterday, they had officers on the ground immediately. They responded really well by all accounts, and a really professional group of officers are trained at our airports for counter-terrorism first response and also incidents like this.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's always sort of been common logic, I guess, that of all the places in the world, you're safest, and an airport might be one of them in terms of every square inch is covered by CCTV, and it's a really difficult place to commit a crime, but it does mean that if a crime is committed there by someone who doesn't mind getting caught, that it could be catastrophic. And as we've seen with terror attacks on airports overseas in the past, and attempted attacks here as well that have thankfully been thwarted before casualties were sustained. One of the things that I think is quite interesting out of this, and it comes on the heels of the assassination of Abe Shinzo in Japan, where cultures or countries that don't have a gun culture and sometimes can be a bit complacent about the possibility of firearms-related crime happening, are sort of shaken up a little bit that this was even possible. And I know you've got some statistics and some insights into why Australians really shouldn't be complacent or naive about the possibility of gun crime here.
Yeah, look, particularly since Port Arthur, the mass shooting that we had there 25 years ago last year, there was a significant change in legislation led by the then Prime Minister John Howard, and reductions certainly in numbers of firearms holders and licence holders for firearms in Australia. But we can't be complacent, Joe, you're right, because the University of Sydney actually did a study last year, and they've identified that in Australia at that point, we've got over 3.5 million firearms that are legally obtained, in our Australian community. There's also obviously a large number, they estimate over 250,000 weapons that could still be in our communities that aren't registered or aren't registered with licensed holders. That equates to about 4 firearms per licensed holder in Australia. So there's still a significant amount of weapons in our community. Thankfully, it's quite a strong sentiment across Australia that you only should be having firearms licence when you have good reason to, and we have excellent police records in terms of licensing for weapons across Australia. But there is still obviously examples of weapons being obtained illegally, or with the rise of 3D printing or other improvised weapons, as we saw in the case apparently of Shinzo Abe with his assassination, a weapon improvised by the alleged shooter there. We can't be complacent. This still could happen in Australia, and we saw an incident in Canberra Airport yesterday where a weapon was obtained and shots were put around the airport in Canberra.
Yeah, and that's just echoing those points, but we should be clear as well that we've no information to suggest that this is an act of terror or even that there was an intent to cause harm. It's hard to imagine there was an intent to cause fear, but discharging a firearm in public is certainly not a trivial offence. But we don't know any details at all at the moment about the potential motives, other than that the individual has been charged and is awaiting a mental health assessment. So we can't suggest anything in that way along those lines, nor would we. But it is important to understand that risk is there, and look at as much as a former firearms owner and licensed holder and recreational shooter. We always used to say, well, that it's not the legal gun owners that are the ones causing the problems, but that's not entirely true. We've seen incidents where just recently with the fence line dispute in rural Victoria, where a couple were murdered over a fence line by someone who owned a rifle on legal grounds for pest control because it was a farm, but it provided a murder weapon, and you could make the argument whether the murder would have happened regardless, and we can go down that rabbit hole. But the case in point is that there are firearms in Australia. We do have, well, some people do have access to them. There's a disturbing number of legally owned firearms that go missing or are lost or stolen each year that then become black market firearms. And as you said, 3D printing if we look at the weapon that was used in the Abe assassination, that was completely homemade, battery charged. There was a lot of ingenuity that went into making a very crude firearm. He's kind of lucky he didn't blow his own hands off, to be honest. But it doesn't mean just because we have gun control that we're safe, and that organisations have to take that seriously. And on that, Jason, I might throw to you because you've been involved not only in policing, in the response side of things, in the investigation side of things, but also as a private security manager for organisations that conducted active armed defender training and certainly had it on their risk register that this was a risk for them. I'll just get you to speak to perhaps some of the challenges you've had with, I guess, people being aware of what that risk is and how they should respond to it, and some of the complacency that can set in afterwards.
Sure, Joe, thanks. Look, through my years of working with various entities, organisations, government departments, even not-for-profits, there is a very large scale of complacency about this type of threat, the active armed offender. And yes, people are correct. This isn't occurring in Australia in our jurisdiction to the same rate or extent, for example, as it is in the United States of America, with a very different gun culture of violence, gun ownership, and use of weapons and attacks. However, as has quite accurately been pointed out, there are still weapons in the community and these incidents do occur. I think one of the major sources of complacency is emergency planning within organisations. Most organisations and leaderships believe they have an emergency plan. They do their biannual evacuation scenario trainings. They do their evacuation where everyone walks out of the building. However, and that is reasonable, that most likely emergency situation is not an active armed offender. However, they miss the opportunity to rehearse, to drill, to test those emergency procedures in respect to an active armed offender. It is a threat that exists. It was interesting watching the footage, the minimal footage which is available. I think down to those individual behaviours where people are not aware of how to manage themselves in such an incident. There was a plethora of footage on social media of groups and crowds of people standing 15, 20 metres away as the offender was being handcuffed, which indicates a lack of awareness of the potential for more than one attacker. If it was a more complex incident, a more planned attack with more malicious intent involved, secondary shooters would have taken advantage of that scenario, the context of people standing, taking video footage, the possibility of multi-mode attacks where there is firearms used, an edged weapon, a blunt weapon, and then an incendiary and explosive device, which again have been used in the Australian context over recent years to affect attacks against various places. So that lack of awareness of what to do in emergencies, the lack of the guidance, active armed defender guidance, the escape, hide, tell mantra is quite common and something which needs to be reinforced. And speaking to duty of care, employers, business owners, government departments need to take the opportunity to drill into their staff. These incidents do happen. Having worked in a number of sectors, more often than not, it's been as a result of a personal grievance against the business, a former or very recently former employee, even down to the context of breakdown in domestic relationships and that domestic violence coming into the workplace and manifesting as an active armed offender in the workplace. Some of the key elements which fall down if not tested in your more usual regular emergency situations, your command control, your emergency communications, your evacuation routes, your places of safety may be very different in an active armed offender scenario. There have been active armed offender events in the States where the attacker has initiated a fire alarm knowing that people will evacuate through certain routes and congregate in certain specific defined areas as per the emergency diagram where they become targets yet again. So these things need to all be considered. Who has command and control? How are we communicating? What are we communicating to our staff? And there's some very difficult conversations to have. If you think most of our businesses, airports included, this occurred on the land side of the airport. So before that secure line where everyone entering the airport to airside is screened for weapons prohibited items. Airports and a lot of our businesses are designed to welcome people in, facilitate access, not restrict or inhibit access. So these are all conversations which need to be had within the organisation, the business, contextually specific. What can we do? What should we do? What is doable and realistic in an active armed offender scenario?
Yeah, you raise a lot of great points there, Jason. And I think it's, again, just to reiterate something we said earlier, and I think this is the big sort of shake-up moment for a lot of Australian businesses. It doesn't have to be terrorism related for this to happen. It could just be someone having a mental breakdown. It could just be, and I shouldn't trivialize it or by say just be, but it could be domestic violence related. It could be a grievance against a company where someone feels like they have lost everything and it's their fault and there's nothing to be gained anymore. If you look at the active shooter literature coming out of the US, where obviously there's a lot more data to draw from, one of the most common behavioral indicator is suicidal ideation. So it's usually someone who is already suicidal that will then go out and become homicidal because you can achieve a lot more when you don't worry about your escape plan, I guess. So there's a lot of that we need to consider. Drawing upon just this last weekend as well, without going into detail about the case, there was two women were shot in a vehicle in Sydney. There was two passengers in the rear of the car that were not harmed, but obviously traumatized. But while it is known that at least one of the victims did have, or that police believe that she had connections to gangland figures, we don't know about the second victim nor the two people that were almost caught up in it. And I think there's a lesson there that just because you might not hang out with people that have guns doesn't mean that you might be near someone who does, or that might come to a workplace, or that could just as easily have been a domestic homicide that happens at a workplace and turns into a mass casualty event as well. So there's a lot of different angles to this. Leanne, from a policing point of view and intelligence point of view, obviously the police can only do what they can do. Thankfully, this one was at an airport where there's a heavy police presence. If this had happened at any other building, any other non-government building in Canberra, it would have been a different situation. And certainly as we go into rural and remote areas, it gets even harder to provide any sort of protection. What are the things that we can do, or what that businesses can do, that everyday individuals can do to assist the police with being able to detect these behaviors before they become life-threatening, and also to be able to assist with response?
So there's a few key things, Joe. As you said, intelligence is really critical for police agencies, for intelligence agencies to get information about people who may be radicalised online, or may be exhibiting some sort of issue-motivated grievance against their business, their employer, or family members, etc. Now that's that could be a lot of people, a lot of issues, and we understand that's difficult. But the more intelligence that is provided to people early, if you have real concerns about people, and we've seen this in the US a lot, where post-incident debriefs, a lot of people knew that there was a concern about a particular person. They just either didn't feel that they should be coming forward, or people weren't pulling the pieces together to be able to alert authorities. So that's number one. That's critical, sharing that information, that intelligence as early as they can. For businesses themselves, the Australian New Zealand Counterterrorism Committee guidelines around crowded places have been developed with businesses. They've looked at the various risk factors, from terrorism-related offences to those domestic sorts of situations that you've outlined there, Joe. So again, they provide a good starting point for guidance for organisations in terms of how they need to be conscious about what's happening with their own staff, how do they keep their staff safe, who they need to liaise with in terms of safety and security for their premises, for their people. So a good starting point, and then they can reach out for training or other support from organisations such as Risk to Solution or other groups.
Yeah, excellent. That information sharing is so critical. And in the threat assessment literature, we talk about behavioural leakage, or leakage of intent, and it's so uncommon. It almost never happens. An attack happens like this, where there isn't some leakage of intent prior, where they haven't disclosed something, bragged to somebody, made the threat to somebody, promised to do something to somebody, and that information just never gets communicated through the appropriate channels. And that is something that we all have a part to play in, because we never know if you're going to be the person that overhears it, or you're going to be the person that they feel safe venting that to, and that might end up saving lives. Jason, I might just throw to you a question just about the impact of COVID, because we've had many internal discussions about the impact of lockdowns and anti-socialization, and issues regarding everyone going virtual, and access then to online radicalization, just a general dissatisfaction and discontent with government and with the man, quote unquote, and how that is impacting both our national security picture, but also just our general interpersonal security.
Yes, good pickup, Joe. It's through the work that we do, occupational violence aggression management, working with various customer-facing or client-facing teams, and even teams who don't have external clients. Any context where you are engaging with people, colleagues even, there's potential for conflict. What we have observed over COVID is from both sides. Individuals have been isolated from their normal support systems within the community, family, friends, workplaces, peers. Everyone has been stressed and affected by the impact of COVID. No one has not been affected to some degree, affecting their work life, their family life, job security, the ability to put food on the table. And with the known reported prevalence of mental health conditions throughout the community, United Nations, for example, estimates that 1 in 4 individuals in the community is experiencing or suffering from a mental health condition, which may or may not manifest in outwards aggression or violence in a range of contexts. So we've developed that situation where people don't have access to their normal support services. Their access is limited to online sources of media and influence, some of it radical, some of it extremist. We've seen a rise in anti-government, anti-establishment rhetoric within Australia, evidenced by recent protests over the last few years, anti-COVID, the rise of the situation of sovereign citizens even within Australia. So manifesting, expressing that dissatisfaction with their current situation, context, government and regulatory controls, sometimes in violent ways. Added to this, a lot of our customer-facing service providers, our staff, our frontline staff, whether they be law enforcement, customer service at the airport, they also have been affected by COVID, which impacts their ability to identify escalating behaviours in other, manage their own emotional responses. But they've also, like any skill, any muscle, if you don't practice that observation, identifying escalating behaviours, effectively verbally de-escalating or escalating those up to a higher authority, you diminish some of that ability, you lose some of that ability to some degree. So we're a little bit rusty in identifying these behaviours and helping identify individuals who may need extra attention, extra support in the community, even only briefly in a customer-facing context. So there's a number of different impacts that COVID have had across the board in this context.
Yeah, you raised so many good points there, Jason, and I think that's something that we all have to be aware of, that even though things are starting to head back towards normal, we can't undo some of the psychological damage that will have been done and how people have lived over the last 2 years. Yeah, Leanne, certainly in your former position, you were in charge of national security from an AFP point of view. And even just the change in terrorism profiles and the rise of the right-wing terrorism as a threat, the combining of different groups that perhaps separately weren't an issue, but now you've got neo-Nazis standing beside bikies, standing beside patriot groups and so on, who 95% of them aren't violent and have no desire to cause violence. But when you put enough of those 5% close together, they can become the spark that unfortunately start something much worse. So I think it is something that we have to be aware of. It's been an incredibly fertile time for terrorism recruitment over the last 2 years, because one of the things that terrorism recruiters want is angry, sad, isolated people. Those are the ones that are most easily manipulated into causing harm and committing acts of violence because they're seeking significance and belonging and hierarchy and a sense of importance. And those are the people that are most receptive to that message. And the last 2 years has given us an awful lot of sad, lonely, angry, isolated people. So it is something we have to be aware of. It also can't be underplayed that we have to be aware of just people's general mental health. It's always hard to ascertain actual mental health statistics and try and connect them to causative factors, but it'd be very, very unlikely that our mental health has improved through 2 years of social isolation and threat of COVID and so on. And probably the last point I'll make about that is just regarding, again, going back to threat assessment literature. We know that some people have violent tendencies. We know that some people are angry people and don't manage their emotions very well. But even those people do tend to keep it in check until there's a destabilizing event in their life. And that destabilizing event is the one that often precipitates the major incident that comes to define them. And COVID for a lot of people may have been that destabilizing event. It could be a loss of employment. It could be a loss of relationship. It could be a loss of social standing. It could be a loss of a business. There could be a lot of things that, through no fault of anybody, that person has lost something that now destabilizes them and sends them on a really nasty course. So I think it is something to round this out as we talk about access to firearms in Australia. Yes, they exist. Yes, they're around. No, you don't need a firearm to cause harm. Active armed offender incidents take place in all sorts of ways. Just because we don't see it reported often here doesn't mean that it's not a threat. Certainly through our work that we do with a variety of clients, we hear a lot more anecdotal evidence of serious attacks and assaults that happen in workplaces, in schools, in hospitals, that never get picked up by the media. It's so important that we don't put our head in the sand and assume it can't happen here and therefore we don't have to do anything about it, because it will happen here. And if it is you or your loved ones that are in the way, then you're going to hope that you'd prepared something for it, and you're going to want to know that you did everything you possibly could to mitigate that risk and to be as ready as possible should it ever happen. Those are my closing thoughts. Leanne, I might throw to you for any closing thoughts or anything we haven't spoken about.
Joe, I'd just probably reiterate what you said at the beginning. We're so thankful that no one was injured in the incident that occurred here in Canberra yesterday. But yeah, we can't be complacent. We just need to continue to share intelligence, share information, but also trust that our law enforcement authorities here in Australia are trained really well. They're experts at this. and we'll see how the court process unfolds in relation to that incident. But there are things that we can do as individuals to be much more observant in our workplaces, in our domestic situations, and there is a lot of help out there for people as well. So reach out.
Yeah, well said. And just to reiterate that, we need to be proactive about that. We need to make sure people are getting help. We need to make sure people know they can get help, to destigmatize that process, to destigmatize what happens if I say that my colleague is worrying me with some of the things that they're talking about or things they're searching. I don't want to get them in trouble. I don't want them to get arrested. And I mean, we've heard over and over again about people that didn't raise concerns because they felt if they dobbed them in, to use an Aussie phrase, if they dobbed them in, they're going to get deported, and they don't want that to happen to that person. So therefore, nothing gets said, and we end up with a tragedy. So we need to destigmatize that as well, so that people know that there are softer supports available, and that person may get the help they need. They're not necessarily just going to be in front of a judge. Jason, any closing thoughts from you?
Look, you've both spoken to the complacency, and all I can say to summarise that up is, don't allow that complacency to guide your awareness, your mitigations. Have the conversations with your teams. Engage consultants. Seek advice. There is a abundance of material out there on how to manage active armed offender scenarios or situations, and as we've seen quite clearly, it does and it will continue to occur in the Australian context. So don't be complacent. Review your procedures, make them realistic, make them workable, work with your people, increase that awareness so they're aware of the threat that it does exist and options that are available to them to manage in the unfortunate circumstance that it does occur at a workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, probably just the final thought on that for those of our audience, I guess, that are security managers or safety managers, and they're wondering, like, what sort of frameworks do I need to look at to try and keep my people safe? Even before you engage a specialist consultant, if you're in critical infrastructure and you are following SOCI legislation, and you'll be doing things like good cybersecurity that will pick up some of these things. Good personnel security will be vetting and behavioral assessments and so on to make sure that we are looking for those early signs of distress. Good physical security. Those are things that we need to look at. Then we start talking about training. If you're a federal government agency, then you'll be familiar with the PSPF. If you're doing everything in the PSPF, you should be addressing a lot of these risks. Most state governments are now releasing their own state versions of a PSPF as well. Again, they're all looking pretty similar, and so they should. Best practice is best practice. So if you're doing those things well, then you should be on the right path. After that, it becomes a matter of understanding your unique risk profile, understanding what the actual problems are that you need to solve, and what are the best ways you can solve the resources you have available. And that's where perhaps a specialist consultant like Risk2 Solution might be able to assist you. But you don't need to engage a consultant to get started. That's probably a really important thing that everyone needs to take away from this. All right. On that note, I think we might close it out. Thank you very much, Leanne, for your time, and Jason for your time. I wish we would actually get together and chat about things that aren't like national security related, but it's always good to share some time with you all. So thank you very much. Thank you once again to my esteemed colleagues, Leanne Close and Jason Alcorn, as we discuss this particular incident. If you'd like more information about Risk2 Solution, make sure you go to www.risk2solution.com. And if you'd like more information about the Protective Security in Government conference that we'll be running in Canberra in October, go to www.psgconference.com.